There are moments in a public life that arrive like a verdict, not a headline, not a news cycle, something heavier than that. A moment where the carefully constructed image, the one that has been polished and protected and reinforced for nearly 2 decades, finally cracks in front of the entire world. And what spills out is not the man we were sold. It is the man who was always there, underneath. Barack Obama had one of those moments. Millions of people watched it happen. And for the first time in a very long time, the protective layer that has shielded him from honest scrutiny since the day he walked onto the national stage was not there to catch him. The fall was televised. The reckoning has begun. And I want to walk you through it carefully, because how we got here matters. Let me take you back to October of 2009. Barack Obama has been president for less than a year. The economy is bleeding jobs, Americans are scared, and the man elevated to the most powerful office on earth makes a decision that, in retrospect, told you everything. He boards Air Force One and flies to Copenhagen to personally lobby the International Olympic Committee to hand the 2016 Summer Games to Chicago. He brings Michelle, he brings Oprah, he gives a speech about himself, about what the Games would mean to him, about his identity, his neighborhood, his story, the full performance. And then, in front of the entire world, the IOC eliminated Chicago in the first round of voting. First round, before they had even narrowed it down to a continent. The President of the United States had flown to Europe, put his personal prestige on the line, and been bounced like a regional bid from a city no one had heard of. A network anchor called it a kick in the pants. It was more than that. It was a tell. It was the moment, if you were paying attention, where you saw exactly who Barack Obama was. A man who believed the sheer wattage of his own celebrity could substitute for preparation, for substance, for the unglamorous work of actually building a case. It couldn't then. It never could. And the moment we are living through now, the public unraveling that has so many of his admirers in stunned silence, is the same lesson, finally arriving at full volume. Let's talk about the legacy, because his defenders love that word. The legacy. As if repetition could conjure a record that the documents do not support. What exactly is the Obama legacy? Let's be honest about it. He passed one major piece of legislation in 8 years. 1. The Affordable Care Act. A law so internally contradictory that premiums climbed, deductibles ballooned, and millions of Americans who had been promised they could keep their doctor and keep their plan discovered the hard way that they could keep neither. If you like your plan, you can keep your plan. That sentence alone should have been disqualifying. It was not an exaggeration. It was not a simplification. It was a deliberate, repeated, documented falsehood told directly to the American people to sell a bill that could not sell itself on the merits. Beyond that, what was there? A patchwork of executive orders that the next administration unwound with the stroke of a pen. International agreements deliberately structured to avoid Senate ratification, because he knew they could not survive it. The Paris Accord, celebrated as transformative, was engineered to bypass the legislative branch entirely. He called that a victory. The American people called it what it was. A president going around the Constitution because he could not persuade even members of his own party. Now let's talk about the political record, the actual documented one. Under Barack Obama, the Democratic Party suffered the most catastrophic electoral collapse of any party under any president in modern American history. Over 1,000 seats lost. State legislatures gutted. Governorships flipped. The House gone. The Senate gone. By the time he left office, the party he led was a coastal rump, hollowed out across the heartland, with no bench, no farm system, and no message that connected with the people who used to vote for it. He campaigned brilliantly. He governed in a way that made his own party unelectable everywhere that mattered. And then, this is the part that should still infuriate every Democrat who ever believed in him. He endorsed Hillary Clinton, watched her lose to Donald Trump, and quietly began repositioning himself as an elder statesman above the fray. The man who broke the party walked away from the wreckage without a scratch, at least in the media's telling. The voters in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, the ones who had pulled the lever for him twice and then for Donald Trump, they understood. They were not the racists the commentariat needed them to be. They were people who had waited for the hope and the change, and watched 8 years go by without it ever arriving. They were people whose factories had closed, whose wages had stagnated, whose opioid-ravaged communities had been met with a White House more interested in climate conferences in Paris than in the devastation in their own backyards. They rendered their verdict. He never understood why, because understanding why would have required a kind of self-examination he has never been capable of. And then there is what came out in July of 2025. The chapter that, more than any other, will define how history actually grades this presidency. Tulsi Gabbard, in her capacity at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, released the documents. The cables, the emails, the contemporaneous records, the whistleblower accounts. And what they show is an outgoing administration that could not accept the verdict the American people had just delivered and set about doing something about it. The January 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment, the founding document of the entire Russia collusion narrative, was constructed in a way that the senior officials building it knew was not supported by the underlying evidence. The Steele dossier, privately dismissed by the Director of National Intelligence himself as discredited, was simultaneously laundered into the assessment as if it were credible. A senior intelligence official spent years trying to report through proper channels, to the Inspector General, to the Special Counsel, to a United States Senator, more than a dozen offices, and was ignored, marginalized, and pressured to put their name on a document they believed to be false. Some fact-checkers, the same fact-checkers who spent 4 years insisting the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, have pushed back on the framing. They say the assessments were not technically in contradiction. They say Russia never claimed to have changed vote tallies, only that it tried to influence opinion. That is a fine distinction if you want to make it. But here is what is not a fine distinction. An administration took an intelligence process, pointed it toward a predetermined political conclusion, and weaponized the resulting document against a duly elected successor. Trump used the word treason. I will let history make the appropriate characterization. What I will say is this. What the documentary record shows is an administration that placed its own political interests above its constitutional obligations and believed itself so morally certain that ordinary rules did not apply. That mentality runs through the entire era like a thread. You saw it in the IRS targeting of conservative nonprofits, a scandal real enough that the agency paid settlements and that the press could never quite bring itself to take seriously. You saw it in the contempt citation against Eric Holder, the first sitting attorney general in American history, held in contempt of Congress, over a gun-running operation whose weapons turned up at the murder scene of a federal agent. You saw it in the surveillance of journalists. You saw it in the use of the Espionage Act against more whistleblowers than every previous president combined. The constitutional law professor, the civil libertarian, the Nobel Peace Prize winner who was at war for all 8 years of his presidency. Let that sit with you for a moment. I want to address something directly because I know how these conversations get framed. Criticizing Barack Obama is not about race. It never was. The press spent 8 years insisting that anyone who questioned his record was operating in bad faith, and millions of Americans looked at that, looked at their own lives, and stopped trusting the press. Can you blame them? You can believe Barack Obama was a failed president and still believe that he and his family deserve to be treated with basic human decency. Those two things are not in conflict. Some of the people who will use the legitimate critiques to score uglier points are the same people who circulated genuinely vile material about the Obamas earlier this year. And that was wrong, and it should have been condemned, and the case I am making is not that case. The case I am making is about conduct, about record, about consequence. The case I am making is the one the documents themselves now make. Here is the thing about Barack Obama that his admirers have never been able to fully process. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality was not incidental. It was structural. He was a man extraordinarily gifted at describing a world he wanted to live in, and extraordinarily limited in his capacity to do the unglamorous work of actually building it. He could give a speech about unity and run a White House political operation as ruthlessly partisan as anything before it. He could talk about transparency and preside over an administration that fought disclosure at every turn. He could invoke the dignity of the office in language that made his supporters weep, and then do things in that office he would have condemned with equal eloquence had a Republican done them. The Obama Presidential Center, rising years behind schedule and hundreds of millions over budget on the south side of Chicago, is the perfect monument to this. A 225-foot tower in a neighborhood whose families have been priced out to make room for it, whose own residents have called it a concrete tomb, and which does not even house his physical archives. Those are digital. It is, in the most literal sense, a monument that contains nothing. A monument to the idea of Barack Obama rather than to anything he built. Copenhagen was the first warning sign. The man who believed he could walk into a room and charm the International Olympic Committee into handing his city the games, eliminated in round 1, in front of the world. That was 2009. It took the rest of the country a long time to catch up. The executive orders were reversed. The international agreements collapsed. The healthcare law became a byword for government dysfunction. The party he led was obliterated at every level beneath the presidency. The intelligence scandal sits now before a Justice Department strike force. The presidential center stands as a symbol of displacement. The man who promised to be a unifier left behind a country more divided than he found it. He was given every advantage, a fawning press, a Nobel Prize awarded before he had done anything to earn it, supermajorities in his first 2 years, a country that desperately wanted him to succeed, and he squandered it. Not because the opposition was too fierce. Presidents face opposition, not because the challenges were too great. Presidents face challenges. He squandered it because the gap between his self-conception and his actual capabilities was too vast to bridge. He believed in his own legend more than he believed in the work. And when the legend collided with reality, in front of millions, this time with no protective layer to soften the impact, reality won. Time has a way of doing that. The receipts always come due. History will not remember him the way his admirers hoped. It will remember him the way the evidence demands.